First story. It wasn't a little girl. I was camping with my husband and his family at a small, remote lake in New Mexico. There were about 10 people in our group and another group of 6 people in the next campsite. It was nighttime and both groups were doing typical activities, making s'mores, having a few drinks and telling stories, when we all heard what sounded like a little girl yelling out for help. Neither group had children with them, but we were all positive we were hearing a little girl and decided to search the area we heard the noises from together. There was a field behind our campsites, and we all saw a very tall, pure white figure standing maybe 100 feet away from us in the field, making the noises. We all agreed this thing looked maybe 6 feet tall, skinny, and white as can be. We made our way closer to investigate, but whatever it was that we saw started backing off as we got closer, and it disappeared into the trees. All night we continued to hear a little girl calling for help as we tried to sleep. Second story. The Walking Dead. I'm a psychiatric nurse, and early in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. One of our residents was an elective mute, which means that he couldn't talk, but there were no medical reasons as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life and in fact seemed quite normal back then, with the exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the Deep South and joined the military when he was 19, but one night he vanished. He was declared AWOL, and eventually he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a VA hospital emergency room in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion Duchesne, not the real name, and I've been dead for 10 years." Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered with dust, and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His social security number had not been used and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him, I guess via fingerprints. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man and that whomever was claiming to be him simply could not be. They demanded not to be contacted again. Marion paced all day every day, moving his mouth that looked like talking or muttering, but no sound came out. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open as if he were laughing heartily, but not even a breath could be heard. If I talked to him, he appeared to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing because Marion would just grin, and unless told to stay put, he'd get up and start pacing again. On my last day at that job, the last thing I saw was Marion, pacing in the parking lot, throwing his head back to laugh. Later I wondered if all along I'd been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. Third story. The Unrest Stop. I was driving across country with my mom and sister when I was 16 and my sister was 20. It was late, but we were well rested still and alert. We were driving along an interstate and needed gas and a bathroom break, so we stopped at the only rest stop in 200 miles. There was a van full of teenagers on a road trip at the gas station, as well as a small gray car parked at the pump in front of us with 2 young men standing still outside of it. When we got there, everything felt wrong. We'd been on the road for days and seen many rest stops at night and had never been afraid until then. My mom and sister went inside and I stayed in the car. I heard the teenagers say they were creeped out and couldn't get the pump to work, and they left in a hurry. I was watching the car in front of us, and the two men had not moved at all. Not an inch. They weren't talking. They weren't on phones. They were just standing there, still as stone. My sister and mom came running back out to the car, and when they got in, the two men slowly turned to look at us while not moving or pivoting the rest of their bodies, and I swear to fucking shit, we all saw the same thing. They had eyes dark as pitch and empty. Truly empty. Not black, not reflecting any light at all, just a void. We sped out of there and didn't stop until we were in the next city. The worst thing about the entire experience, we couldn't find the place on any map. We knew exactly which spot on the interstate to look, and we couldn't find it on Google Maps or any paper map we had. We even asked locals about the creepy gas station out on that stretch of road and got only confused looks. We've traveled on that interstate since, and there is no rest stop. Fourth story. It came for us in the graveyard. We were driving my friend's really old beat-up Subaru through a massive graveyard. We stopped and walked down a hill and came across a little pond. There was someone sitting on a rock on the other side of the pond. The figure was all black and we couldn't make out any features other than the fact it looked like a man who was wearing some old-style top hat. We stupidly waved and shouted, "Hi." He didn't show any acknowledgement and continued sitting still on the rock. All of a sudden, he jumped to his feet, started running to us on the water and then vanished in thin water about halfway on the pond. My friends and I screamed and ran back to the car. The car wouldn't start, and we heard something banging on the back of the car. It wasn't a constant bang, but every few seconds or so we'd hear it. Nobody was outside from what we could see in the dark, but something was making a noise on the car. I opened my phone and started dialing my mom to come give us a boost, but I had no service. None of us had any cell service. The next 30 minutes were spent trying to get her car started. No banging was heard afterwards, but we felt this heavy pressure around us. Finally, the car started and she hit the pedal to the metal. We sped out of the graveyard so fast. Immediately crossing the gates, all of our phones regained cell service. One thing I know for certain is that someone or something was out there, and it was not an animal or a human. Fifth story. It was good to see an old friend. When I was 37, I went to my high school reunion. I flew into the nearest airport and rented a car. The distance was about 35 miles through a very rural and almost abandoned part of the country. About 3 miles outside of town I see someone on the side of the road, flagging me down. It turned out that it was one of the guys I had attended school with. Jim, not his name, gets in the car and we start talking. I had not seen him in 20 years, but he still looked the same, maybe a little older. We get to town and I asked him if he wants to come to the VFW and have a drink. He says, "No, just take me home." Jim's parents had lived only a few blocks from my grandmother's house, and I turned in that direction, but he said to take him to the outskirts of town. There was a mobile home park out there, and I figured that is where he lived. When we reached the end of the turnoff he said, "Just drop me here. It was good to see you again," and he walks off into the night. I go to the VFW, met some of my old classmates, we start to talk. As we are talking about who is coming to the reunion, I mention that I had just picked Jim up 3 miles east of town and had dropped him off. Everyone gets quiet. Even the guy singing karaoke stops and lays down the mic. My cousin goes white as a new t-shirt. Barb, Jim died on that curve 8 years ago. Rolled his car. We were all at his funeral, I was told. I started to feel really dizzy, and I went out to the car to take some deep breaths. There on the seat is the local newspaper, printed 8 years previous, containing Jim's obituary. I still have the paper. First story. Human chair. Hello. What you are about to read will shock you. I need to confess the strange and terrible crime I have committed, and I can't bear to keep my secret any longer. I beg you not to stop reading. For years, I have hidden myself away from the world. You see, I am hideously ugly. Too ugly to describe. You would be shocked and horrified at the sight of my face. I was a miserable and wretched creature, because I never knew love. I never felt the affectionate touch of a hand or the warm feeling of a pair of lips brushing against mine. I was a carpenter by trade, and I worked all day in a factory, making furniture. My specialty is making chairs. My skilled hands carved the wood, screwed the pieces together, fashioned the back rests and arm rests, and did the upholstery, padding the cushions and sewing the covers. As I worked, I felt like an artist creating a great masterpiece. When my chairs were finished, I would always test them out to make sure they were comfortable. It gave me a great thrill to imagine all the different people who would sit on the chair I created. Unlike me, they had wonderful, happy lives. They had someone they loved and who would love them back. Every time I thought of them, I felt nothing but misery and despair. One day, I was designing a new type of chair, and, as I worked, a very strange idea began to take form in my mind. I changed the design and made a hollow space inside. It was a cavity large enough to fit a human body. Of course, I had to take out a lot of the wooden framework and the springs inside. The knees would be just below the seat, the head and upper body would be inside the backrest. Someone could sit inside the chair and no one would ever know they were there. I left a small space for supplies, like food and drinks, and I even included a little potty for pee and poo. By the time I was finished, the chair had become a miniature home. I stripped off my clothes and climbed inside the chair. Can you imagine how strange that felt? It was a tight fit, but I managed to get used to it after a while. I was in complete darkness, but I could hear what was going on around me. I heard my colleagues walking around the factory, looking for me. They had no idea that I was right under their noses. After a while, some delivery men loaded me into a truck and transported me to a furniture store. They put me on display in the middle of the shop floor and left me there. I was perfectly concealed and nobody was any the wiser. I was like a crab or a turtle, but instead of a shell, I had my chair. Almost as soon as I arrived, customers started testing out the chair. I can't tell you how many unknown bottoms sat down on me. Some of them had big, fat bottoms like a jellyfish, and others had thin, bony bottoms like a skeleton. Some had firm buttocks like a horse, and others had chubby buttocks, bouncing up and down on me like a rubber ball. It was an amazing feeling. I could feel the warmth of their flesh through the material. Their shoulders rested against my chest and their arms and hands rested on mine. Not one of them suspected that the soft cushion they were sitting on was actually little old me. Previously, because of my grotesque and disturbing appearance, people had always recoiled at the sight of me, but now my skin was virtually touching theirs through a thin layer of cloth. Hidden inside the chair, I imagined myself hugging them, kissing them and wrapping my arms around them in a passionate embrace. Of course, it was a strange sort of existence. After spending so long inside the chair, sitting in the same position, my muscles started to wither away. I could barely move and my body was crooked and bent. I was folded up like a contortionist, but I didn't care. All I could think about was the exquisite feeling of having people sit on me. One day, somebody bought my chair. The delivery men picked me up, put me in the back of a van and brought me to the home of a nice family. They put me in their living room, facing the TV. Within days, every member of the family had sat on me at least once. I was in heaven. But there was one member of the family I loved more than all of the others. This person was very special to me and, as time went on, I began to fall in love with them. I couldn't help myself. Whenever they sat down on me, I tried to make my knees as comfortable as possible for them. Whenever they leaned back on me, I would embrace them more warmly and make them nice and snug. When they felt tired, I would move my knees back and forth, gently rocking them to sleep. You may think I was mad, but I was madly in love with this person. I became obsessed with them and I longed for them to return my feelings. I reached the point where I felt that if only they knew I was there, they would fall in love with me too. The person loved to read, so I came up with a cunning plan. I wrote sewn my story and submitted it to a website they frequented. By now, you've probably guessed who I am talking about. That's right, it is you. I have been in your home for so long, you've probably forgotten where I came from. Every night, I crawl out of the chair and sneak upstairs to watch you sleep. I can't bear to be away from you for a moment. I love you and I think you could love me too. If only you saw me. Now, after you finish reading this, please turn around and look at me. I'll be waiting. Don't be afraid. Come and sit down on my knees. I miss your touch. Second story. Greenbrier. There was a young woman named Elva Zona Shu who lived in Greenbrier County in West Virginia. She was married to a man named Edward who worked as a blacksmith. They seemed very happy together, but Zona's mother never liked Edward Shu and warned her daughter not to trust him. One day, after they had been married only 3 months, Edward sent a young African-American boy named Andy Jones to his house on an errand. He was supposed to ask Zona if there was anything she needed from the store. The boy found Zona's body lying on the floor at the bottom of the stairs. Her eyes were wide open and staring right at him. She was dead. The boy ran home to tell his mother and she raised the alarm. Edward went home, carried his wife's body up to the bedroom and dressed her in her Sunday best. When the coroner arrived an hour later, he found the dead woman wearing a stiff-collared dress that covered her neck and she had a veil over her face. Edward was cradling his wife's head and sobbing hysterically. When the coroner tried to take a closer look, Edward reacted so violently that the coroner gave up and left. He listed her cause of death as being due to childbirth. The strangest thing about it was that Zona had not even been pregnant. When Zona's mother found out her daughter was dead, she shouted, "The devil has killed her." During the funeral, Zona's mother took a sheet from inside the coffin and brought it home. When she washed it in a basin, the water turned as red as blood. The old woman believed this was a sign that Zona had been murdered. Every night for the next 4 weeks, Zona's mother prayed that the truth about her daughter's death would be revealed. She didn't have long to wait. One night, the ghost of Zona appeared to her mother and told her exactly how she had died. She said Edward was cruel and abusive to her. One day, he went too far. She told him she had no meat for his dinner and Edward flew into a rage. He attacked his wife and broke her neck. When she said this, the ghost slowly turned her head completely around at the neck. The next morning, Zona's mother went to the police and told them what she had seen. Although they were skeptical, they dug up Zona's body again and performed a proper autopsy. When he heard the news, Edward began to get nervous and stressed out. He wandered around the town saying, "They will not be able to prove I did it." The autopsy revealed that Zona's neck had been broken and she had been strangled to death. On her throat were the marks of fingers. Edward Shue was arrested and charged with murder. When the police investigated his background, they found some suspicious facts. Edward had a violent temper. He had beaten his first wife severely and thrown her out of the house. His second wife had died mysteriously of a blow to the head. As he sat in his jail cell, Edward was sure he would not be convicted of Zona's murder. He told everyone who would listen that there was no evidence against him. During the trial, Zona's mother was called to testify on the stand. She told the jury how Zona's ghost had appeared to her and revealed the name of her murderer. Nobody knows if the jury took her story seriously, but they did come back with a guilty verdict and Edward was sentenced to life in prison. He died a few years later in Moundsville Penitentiary. Today, there is a sign on the highway near Greenbrier. It reads, "Greenbrier Ghost. Interred in nearby cemetery is Zona Heaster Shue. Her death in 1897 was presumed natural until her spirit appeared to her mother to describe how she was killed by her husband Edward. Autopsy on the exhumed body verified the apparition's account. Edward, found guilty of murder, was sentenced to the state prison. Only known case in which testimony from ghost helped convict a murderer." Third story. Gone fishing. This morning, bright and early, my friend Oleg and I decided to go fishing. We live in a very small town and there is never much to do. We were dying of boredom. However, this morning, it was even more quiet than usual. The streets were empty and there was nobody around. The town was eerily quiet. We went down an overgrown path that led to the river. When we got there, we saw a strange figure in a dark green hood crouching on the river bank. He was holding a fishing rod in his hand. "Good morning," I called out. "Are the fish biting today?" The man didn't answer. He just gave a hoarse laugh and started to sway slightly from side to side. I went closer and asked again, "Are the fish biting?" I took 2 more steps and then stopped in my tracks. The man began to sway faster and faster. I couldn't see his face because it was obscured by the hood. Just then, I saw something that horrified me. At his feet, there was a human hand, severed at the wrist. I felt a chill run down my spine and I started to back away. The man slowly turned his head to face me. I saw a pair of piercing red eyes and sharp dark yellow teeth. Instead of a nose, he just had 2 triangular holes. He stared directly at me and opened his mouth in a bloody grin. I turned and ran back to Oleg. Not knowing what I had seen, he looked at me in bewilderment. I glanced behind me. The man in the hood was standing up and coming towards us. Without waiting to see what would happen next, I grabbed Oleg by the hand and dragged him with me, shouting, "Run!" We rushed into the trees, looking back over our shoulders every 5 seconds to make sure the man wasn't following us. We sprinted through the undergrowth and made our way to the police station. On the way, I told Oleg in a trembling voice about the severed hand and the man's terrifying face. He was scared too. When we reached the police station, I pulled on the door handle, but it was locked. We both pounded on the glass, but there was no answer. "Listen, I'm going to see if I can get inside," I said. "You stay here and keep watch in case that crazy guy comes." Oleg was shaking and said, "But I'm scared. What am I going to do if he—" I didn't let him finish. I ran around the corner and found an open window at the back of the building. I climbed up through it and found myself in the bathroom of the police station. When I opened the door, I peered out and saw a dark corridor. The light was flickering ominously. Summoning all my courage, I walked down the hallway and came to an office. The room was empty and there were papers and furniture strewn across the floor. The phone was broken into pieces and the desk had been overturned. Just then, I heard someone shouting. It was coming from the street and it sounded like Oleg. I was about to rush to the front door and let him in when I heard a rustling sound. Suddenly another door in the corridor opened and I saw a figure lurking in the darkness. "Who's there?" I demanded. There was no response, but I saw 2 familiar red eyes peering at me from the darkness. I froze horror. For a moment, I was so petrified that I could not move. The figure emerged from the darkness and stepped into the dim, flickering light. It was the same face I had seen at the river, but he was wearing different clothes. It was a policeman's uniform. Suddenly, the man came towards me at lightning speed. He covered a distance of 3 meters in less than a second and grabbed me by the throat with his strong, bony hands. The man stuck out his black tongue, licking his lips and gnashing his crooked teeth. As I watched in horror, his face started shifting and changing right before my eyes. Without thinking, I reached out and grabbed the first thing I could find. It was a pen. I raised it above my head and with all my might, I drove it into the man's neck. Bright red blood gushed from the wound and the man let out a high-pitched screech. His grip loosened on my neck and I managed to break free. I rushed down the hallway and yanked open the first door I saw. Inside, there was a pile of human flesh and gnawed bones. The sight made my stomach turn and a wave of nausea overcame me. I fell to my knees and threw up on the ground. I was shaking with fear. I realized that this was the remains of the other policeman. Just then, I remembered Oleg. He was waiting for me outside. I ran to the front door and opened it. When I saw the familiar face of Oleg on the other side, I wanted to cry. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "I heard you shouting." Oleg nodded. "Everything is fine," he said. "I thought I saw someone moving around inside. Let's go home before that crazy guy comes back." We ran all the way home and when we reached Oleg's house, we found that his parents were not there. On the table, there was a note. "Gone to visit your grandmother. We'll be back late tonight." We went around the empty house, securing all the windows and locking all the doors. We were barricading ourselves inside. Oleg was surprisingly calm. My hands were shaking so much, I could barely hold anything. After we finished securing the house, I picked up the phone to try and get help, but there was no dial tone. We were cut off from the rest of the world. We sat down in the living room and turned on the TV. There was nothing on the news. Everything was going on as usual. Whatever was happening, it seemed to be just confined to our little town. I took out a pen and a sheet of paper and tried to write down exactly what happened to us. I don't know why, but somehow it made me feel better. If we don't make it through this, then at least someone will find this piece of paper and know what happened to us. Oleg is sitting beside me right now, but he is strangely pale. I asked him if he is okay, but he just shrugged his shoulders. Something is wrong. He got up and went to the toilet. He's in there now. All of a sudden, a wild fear seized me. Maybe it's just my paranoia going out of control. From head to toe looked at the pen in his hands. Cannot be, flashed through my head. Trying to speak very loudly but calmly, I asked Oleg, by the way, where is your sister? Did she go with your parents? I heard his voice from the bathroom saying, probably. As the realization slowly sunk in, a cold wave of horror washed over me and I put my head in my hands. I wanted to cry. Oleg doesn't have a sister. In the uneasy silence, I can hear the bathroom door opening with an ominous creak. First story. Creature in the Village. My name is Magda and I'm 26 years old. I work in an office in the city. On weekends, I used to love to get away from all the hustle and bustle and take a trip to the countryside. Luckily, I have a cottage in a small village, which is located right at the edge of the forest. How I used to love to get out of the city and spend the weekend in my little cottage. Why did I stop? Well, I'll tell you. After a hard week at work, I needed a rest, so I decided to get out of town. I went home, packed my bags, threw them in the trunk and drove off. When I arrived in the village, it was late in the evening and I was tired from the long drive. I went straight to bed and fell asleep quickly. In the middle of the night, I was awakened by the sound of my car alarm going off. I looked out the window, but there was nobody in sight. I found my car keys, pressed the button to shut off the alarm. When the awful noise stopped, I lay down again and tried to fall back asleep. All of a sudden, the alarm went off again. I didn't feel like getting up, so I just grabbed my keys and pressed the button again. Everything was peaceful and quiet. 5 minutes later, the alarm went off a third time. Once or twice could have been an accident, but now I was wondering what was going on. Could someone be playing tricks on me in the middle of the night? I got up again and pressed the button to turn off the alarm, but this time, I didn't lay down. I stood at the curtains and watched. After a few minutes, I saw something by the light of the moon. A shadow emerged from the bushes and slowly approached the car. I could just about make out the shape. It was something tall, skinny and black. The figure reached out with its long, thin arms and knocked on the car. The alarm went off again and, quick as a flash, the dark figure retreated back into the bushes. At that moment, I realized what was going on and began shaking with fear. I turned off the alarm and continued to watch. The thing emerged from the bushes again and slid silently over to the gate. threw a hand through them and removed the partition holding the gates closed. I was paralyzed with fear and I couldn't move. My mind was overcome by panicked thoughts. What was it? What did it want from me? What was it doing? Would it ever go away? A shiver ran through my body, from my head down to my toes. My mouth was dry and my heart was beating fast. I was so tense, I was gritting my teeth and clenching my hands into fists. I got control of myself and ran down the stairs as fast as my legs would carry me, to the ground floor. I wanted to look for something I could use to protect myself. However, just as I was about to switch on the lights, I suddenly froze in my tracks. The dark figure was at the window. It was pressed up against the glass, staring in, looking to see whether or not there was someone home. I immediately ducked down behind the sofa and peered out. That's when I realized what all these tricks with the car were for. It was trying to lure its victim outside. I could not take my eyes off its hideous face. The skin was the color of ash and covered with wrinkles. Its eyes were small, beady and completely black. Instead of a nose, there were 2 ragged holes. It didn't have any lips, just 2 rows of sharp, yellow teeth. Its breathing was so heavy and hoarse that it was misting up the window. I just knew it was not going to go away. After standing at the window for a few moments, I heard a rustling noise as it came to the front door. I watched as it tried to push its fingers through the gap under the door. The handle began to twitch wildly up and down. And then the creature emitted a chilling sound. It was not like the human voice. It was a deep, beastly growl, like an angry dog chewing on a bone. I knew that if it heard me, it would keep trying until it found a way to get into the house. I just crouched down behind the sofa, hiding in the shadows and desperately trying not to make a sound. Tears began involuntarily streaming down my face, no matter how much I tried to stop them. I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples and I was shaking like a leaf, just waiting for it to end. I don't know how long I cowered there. I must have passed out. When I woke up and looked at the door, the creature was gone. The door was still in place and everything seemed secure. I have never been so relieved in all my life. I ran upstairs and looked out the window. It was light outside and there was no sign of anything wrong. Taking a chance, I grabbed my keys and, without stopping to collect any of my things, I ran out to the car. I jumped in, locked the doors and drove away from the village as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving until I got back to the city. When I got back to my apartment, I turned on the radio and heard a news report. The announcer said that, in the village, the dead bodies of 2 girls had been discovered. Their corpses had been mutilated and dumped in a swamp. I guess the creature found what it was looking for. Second story. Crazy Lady. The Crazy Lady is a scary horror story about a hunter who lives in a cabin, deep in the woods. One day, he comes across a beautiful young woman who may not be what she seems. Bob had been out in the woods all day, hunting for deer. When he got back to his little cabin, it was almost dark and he was shocked to find the front door was standing open. Cautiously, he crept into the cabin and was surprised to see a young lady standing in front of the fireplace. She was the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. She had a really pretty face and long brown hair that came down to her shoulders. She was wearing a white vest that was tied up over her stomach and a pair of blue jeans that accented her curves. The young lady said her name was Jessica and she was lost. She had come out to the woods to stay at her father's lodge, but had wandered off and couldn't find her way back. She said she had spent all day wandering in the forest, trying to find help. Bob said that he would help her, but it was too late to go walking through the woods. She would have to stay the night in his cabin, and in the morning, he would lead her back to her father's lodge. Jessica thanked him and offered to cook him dinner in return for his kindness. Over dinner, they talked for a while and Bob was glad to have company. He didn't meet many women, living alone as he did, in his little cabin in the woods. Eventually, Jessica started to get sleepy. It was almost 2 o'clock in the morning. Bob told her she could take his bed and he would sleep in a chair. She climbed into bed, fully dressed, and before long, was sleeping soundly. She looked like she needed the rest. Bob watched her as she slept. He thought she was one of the most gorgeous girls he had ever seen. He wondered if she could fall in love with a man like him. She was the kind of woman he had longed for all his life. Young, brown-haired and beautiful. As Jessica slept on the bed, he sat in a chair, listening to music on the radio. He kept the volume low so that he wouldn't wake Jessica. Then, just as he was dozing off, the music on the radio was interrupted by a local news broadcast. The reporter said that the police were combing the area in search of a prisoner who had escaped from the state hospital for the criminally insane. Bob's ears pricked up. The reporter said that the woman who had escaped was armed and dangerous. She had been convicted of the grisly murders of her husband and 4 other men and was sent to prison. Psychologists who examined her declared her mentally ill, and she was transferred to the state hospital for the criminally insane. However, as she was being transported, she managed to overpower her guards, using a knife she had stolen from the prison cafeteria. She stabbed them to death and escaped into the woods. The police had been searching for her all day. On the radio, they gave a description of the crazy lady. She was 5'4", 26 years old, brunette and very attractive. She had been wearing a prison uniform when she escaped, but they said she would probably try to steal some clothes to disguise herself. The police warned people to be on the lookout for the crazy lady and advised anyone who came across her to keep their distance. Bob's blood froze as he looked at Jessica, lying there peacefully on his bed. She fit the description perfectly. Young, brunette, beautiful and completely insane. She was the escaped maniac the police were looking for. He was sure of it. And he was sure of something else too. She was planning to kill him while he slept. He wasn't going to let that happen. He knew what he had to do. Suddenly, Bob jumped out of his chair and threw open the front door of the cabin. Jessica awoke with a fright and looked at him, a confused expression on her face. He grabbed her by the hair, pulling her out of bed and began dragging her towards the door. She started screaming and her arms flailed wildly, trying to catch hold of him. He managed to wrestle her to the front door, then with a mighty heave, he threw her out into the darkness. She landed on the grass outside and immediately jumped up and came running back towards the door. Bob slammed the wooden door shut and had just enough time to lock and bolt it before she slammed into it. He braced himself against the door, expecting her to break it down at any moment. He could hear her outside, pounding on the cabin door with her fists, kicking it with her boots and shouting at him to let her in. And then he heard a scream, an ear-splitting shriek that made him shiver. It sounded like the howls of a crazed animal, the kind of sound that could only be made by a person who was completely insane. Then there was a horrible silence. He could hear something shifting and moving about outside the wooden door. He was shaking with fear, ready for anything. After a while, he noticed a thin trickle of blood coming under the door. Soon, it turned into a pool of blood, flowing across the floor at his feet. Gathering his wits about him, Bob slowly opened the front door and was horrified by what he found. Jessica was lying there in a pool of blood and a large knife was sticking out of her head. She was completely naked and her eyes were glazed over. His mind raced as he tried to understand the strange scene that lay before him. But, stranger still, was the neat pile of blue clothing which was sitting on the grass beside Jessica's dead body. Reaching over her naked corpse, he picked up the blue clothes and, turning them over in his hands, he realized it was a blue uniform. There was some black lettering printed on the back. It read, "State Hospital for the Criminally Insane." He fell to his knees beside the dead girl's body as he finally understood what had happened. The crazy lady had murdered Jessica for her clothes. Third story. Stairs. Two men named Banner and Griswell were hitchhiking on a lonely country road, but no cars would stop for them. They were tired and sick of walking. The sun was setting fast and they needed to find a place to spend the night. They came across an old, deserted house and decided to take shelter inside. The garden was overgrown with weeds and bushes. The front door creaked open on rusty hinges and a carpet of dust lay on the floor. The two men took some tins out of their backpacks and ate a small meal. Then, they unrolled their blankets on the floor, made themselves comfortable and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, Griswell suddenly awakened from a troubled sleep. It was dark and he was shivering with the cold. All of a sudden, he heard a strange noise. It was a high-pitched whistling sound. Just then, he noticed his friend. Banner was standing in the shadows, listening intently. He looked as if he was in some kind of trance. Then, the man began walking slowly up the stairs, his boots clomping on the wooden steps. The shrill whistling grew louder. Griswell wanted to call out to his friend and tell him to come back, but the words died in his throat. Banner kept walking up the stairs and eventually disappeared from view. Suddenly the footsteps stopped and Griswell held his breath. He waited and waited. Then, he heard an awful scream that split the silence of the night and almost made him jump out of his skin. Then, the footsteps resumed and came back down the stairs. Griswell was trembling with fear as he saw a pair of boots walking slowly down the stairs. In the moonlight, he could see a groping hand on the banister. A ghastly chill ran down Griswell's spine when he saw the other hand. It was clutching a bloody hatchet. Then he caught sight of his friend's face. It was deathly pale. His eyes were glazed over and his mouth was twisted in a ghoulish grin. Blood was dripping down his forehead from a huge gash that almost split his skull in two. Griswell let out a blood-curdling shriek and fled from the house. He ran blindly through the pitch-black night, desperately trying to get away from the old house. He ran and ran, all the time imagining his friend chasing him with his bloody axe and his bloody head and his ghastly death grin. He ran and ran until he collapsed exhausted. In the morning, he managed to find a police station and told the sheriff what he had seen. Together, they went back to the old house to check it out. Griswell's blood ran cold at the thought of what they might find. The sheriff opened the creaking door and looked inside. Griswell peered nervously over his shoulder. On the floor, he saw his friend. Banner was lying face down in a pool of blood, his head almost cleaved in half. His dead hand was still clutching the handle of the hatchet. The blade of the hatchet was embedded into the floor, at exactly the same spot where Griswold's head had been lying the night before. The sheriff searched the house from top to bottom, but he didn't find another living soul. When I signed up for a national teaching program, I imagined I'd be sent to the Chicago inner city or the Deep South, not this quaint, quiet New Hampshire town. I just couldn't understand why the place struggled to keep teachers, or any other out-of-town professional, for that matter. There were always vacancies, even though there's virtually no crime, friendly people, and most of all, beautiful countryside. When the colors change in fall, the town looks like a postcard, better than a postcard, in fact, because no flat image could capture the vibrant yellows, flaming oranges, and rich ruby reds that cover every hillside. Tourists drive for miles just to stroll through the colorful rain of falling leaves or snap pictures of the morning mist rolling through apple orchards and barnyards. As a lover of pumpkin spice, Halloween, and all things fall, I was in heaven. Starting at the beginning of October, elementary-age students decorated the classroom with paper cutouts of ghosts and cobwebs. We carved pumpkins, bobbed for apples, and read the legend of Sleepy Hollow. To my surprise, I got a lot of positive phone calls from parents, praising the work I'd put into my classes and telling me how much their children had enjoyed them. Principal Harris even pulled me aside to tell me how impressed he was, and mentioned that if I kept it up, he'd pull all the strings he could to get me a permanent position. Everything was going great until the day of the Halloween sing-along. I'd ordered a CD of spooky but kid-friendly songs, and on the chosen day we turned out the lights, put lit candles inside the pumpkins we'd carved, and sat in a circle to sing. I could feel the children's anticipation build as I turned on the CD player and hit play. After a few creepy sound effects of fluttering bats, screams, and witch cackles, the first track began. Have you seen the ghost of John? Long white bones with the skin all gone. Ooh, 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 ooh. Wouldn't it be chilly with no skin on? As the second verse began, I looked around the classroom. Something was very wrong. The children, who usually loved to sing, were silent, except a few who were crying. Most of them had plugged their ears with their hands. I'd expected the songs to be spooky. But this. Running footsteps announced the arrival of Principal Harris. He sprinted across the classroom and turned off the CD player like someone disabling a bomb at the final second. Are you nuts? He panted. We're going to have a talk about this after your class. Don't ever play that song in this town again. Understand? Give them, I don't know, some notes to study or something. The after-class meeting with Principal Harris was awkward, but I wasn't sure if it was worse for him or for me. He kept picking things up from his desk and setting them down again, looking out the window, and sighing. Finally, he cleared his throat and got to the point. As you know, Harris began cautiously, this is a very old town. We even have one of those. George Washington slept here. B&Bs, can you believe that? He tried to force a laugh. It died in his throat. Anyway, old, small towns like ours tend to have a lot of superstitions. They might seem silly to outsiders, but they're very important to us. It was clear who the outsider was in this situation. Seeing my daydreams of a bright future in this town disappearing fast, I cleared my throat and replied, "If I've done something offensive, I'm sorry. It wasn't my intention, and I appreciate you letting me know so that it won't happen again. Do a lot of people in town have a religious objection to Halloween, or is it more like?" No, nothing like that," Harris scoffed. "We're not a bunch of Bible-thumping hillbillies up here. It's that specific song, and that specific story, in fact, that I need to ask you to avoid." "What? You mean that old folk song, The Ghost of Joe?" "Yes, that one. No need to say more. Let's just not mention it again, all right? You're doing great work here, miss. I'd hate to see it cut short because of a silly misunderstanding." "But why? Let's just drop it, okay?" Harris was almost pleading. It was like even discussing the song was too much for him. "I think I've said all I need to, and you need to get back to class." Ha! Another fake laugh. "Look, just one other thing. You can expect some, negative reactions around town when the children tell their parents about class today. Try to take it in stride. Remember, this is a very sensitive topic for us, miss." I left the ugly fluorescent glow of Principal Harris's office with a bad taste in my mouth and a burning curiosity. What could be so bad about a song, especially one that was hundreds of years old? I went through the rest of the day on autopilot, and bolted for the library as soon as I could. The storied old building, with its red brick and shadowy white columns, was one of my favorite places in town. I'd spent hours there reading, preparing materials, or just chatting with the librarian, Sarah Newman. "Hey Sarah," I waved to the frizzy mass of hair at the reception desk. "How's it going?" "Hello," Mrs. Newman replied curtly. "Can I help you?" I was put off by my friend's reaction, but I wasn't about to stop now. "I wanted to ask you." "I'm afraid I'm very busy." Sarah Newman cut me off, adjusted her glasses, and went back to furiously stamping library books. But I noticed that she glanced up at me again, with a twinge of sympathy in her eye. "If you want to learn about town history, I suggest you check the newspaper archives. Specifically, the October issues from 1989, 1972, and 1958 should do nicely." The rubber stamp resumed its pounding. Our conversation was over. Soon I was reading the headlines from October 1989. 10/1. Students to sing about local legend in Halloween chorus. 10 skeptical smiley face. 8. Protest against. Cursed. Sing-along. Are our children in danger? 10/15. A spooky success. Halloween chorus plays to a full house. 10/22. Local children abducted. Police suspect the worst. 10/29. 5 students found dead, details inside. October 1972. 10/1. New York folklorist to study local legend. 10/8. A stranger in town. An interview with folklorist James Hatterwood. 10/15. Stay out of our graves. Hatterwood's investigation sparks controversy. 10/22. New York folklorist James Hatterwood missing, volunteers needed. 10/29. An unfinished tale. Hatterwood disappearance remains unsolved. And 1958. 10/5. Good time girls and hooligans. A look inside the teen motorcycle craze. 10/12. Miscreants are misunderstood. City Council to ban teenage bikers. 10/19. Angry greasers adopt local legend as their mascot, council concerned. 10/26. Accident or foul play. Parents weep at tragic biker club pileup. The newspaper room was in the basement, and a chill ran over me as I read the articles. It wasn't hard to imagine what the local legend must be: the ghost of John. I didn't believe in ghouls or curses, but it was easy to see why the legend was a sore spot for the locals. I resolved to never mention it again. As I climbed the dim, creaky stairs, a loud buzzing nearly made me jump out of my skin. I had dozens of missed calls. I listened to the voicemails as I drove home. Each one was worse than the last. Parents who only days before had been calling me a blessing, or my child's favorite, were now screaming at me, threatening my life, ordering me out of town, and in a few cases, all three. It brought me to tears. These were the people who'd baked me cookies and showed me around town. How could a simple song have made them so thoughtlessly cruel? By the time I got home, my sadness had turned to tight-fisted anger, or at least that's what I tell myself to justify what I did next. None of this was fair. How was I supposed to know about some dumb superstition? I was still sniffling and wiping my red, puffy eyes when I got out of the car and waved to the Volkers, my neighbors across the street. The two Volker children left their toys on the lawn and went inside without saying a word. Their parents followed them, turning out the porch light as they went. More hot tears streamed down my cheeks. Without thinking twice, I pulled out the CD of Halloween songs and jammed it into my car's CD player. With doors and windows open, I skipped through the tracks in search of one song in particular. When I found it, I played it at full volume. Have you seen the ghost of John? Long white bones with the skin all gone. Ooh, 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 ooh. Wouldn't it be chilly with no skin on? I watched as one by one, porch lights went out and people enjoying the autumn evening scurried back into their houses. I was left alone in the driveway of my rented house, sobbing pitifully into the smoky October twilight. When I awoke the next morning, I had a few happy, quiet moments in my warm bedsheets before I remembered what I'd done. When I did, however, the anger and shame hit me like a punch to the gut. My morning coffee did hula hoops around my stomach. I dreaded what was coming when I got to school. To my surprise, no one mentioned anything. It was like the day before had never happened. Sure, my coworkers suddenly seemed more guarded around me, but there were no red-faced parents looking for a fight, dismissal letters, or hordes of sobbing children. The closest anyone came to mentioning the song was a boy in my second period class. "Hey miss, aren't we gonna finish the song?" he asked. "Shut up, Clayton." The girl next to him jammed an elbow into his rib. "What?" Clayton shrugged. "I liked it. Just because our parents are all freaked out." "Clayton, we can't," another girl hissed. The class began to murmur. I had a teachable moment. Here, it was time to decide whether I was going to support the local superstition or encourage the kids to think for themselves. "I made a mistake playing that song yesterday, Clayton," I replied sweetly. "It bothers a lot of people, and we need to respect their feelings." I felt like a coward, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to put this whole thing behind me. I wanted to go back to how things were when I was first walking around town, coffee in hand, watching the leaves fall. A few quiet days passed. I was beginning to think that I'd survived the first major classroom scandal of my teaching career, a little wiser, a little sadder, maybe, but mostly unscathed. I decided to celebrate. I'd clear my head by visiting some of the kitschy tourist attractions in the small towns nearby. As I drove, however, the weather took a turn for the worse. The misty morning clouds became a weird yellowish gray, and fat raindrops began to fall. Even with my wipers going full blast, it was hard to see. There was something wrong about this weather, something unnatural that put me on edge. That's why I nearly jumped out of my skin when I heard a loud revving behind me. Who would be riding a motorcycle in this weather? The way the black riders appeared out of the rain made me think of the Headless Horseman, but the logo on their leather jackets referenced a different legend. Even in the pouring rain, I could read the bone-white letters around their skeletal mascot, the Ghosts of John. There was music playing above the sound of the rain. Was that Elvis? Shake, rattle, and roll. 6 motorcycles had closed in around me, 3 on either side, and soon I couldn't even hear the rain over the rumble of their engines. What did they want? If this was a joke, it was in very bad taste. If this was meant to scare me, it was working. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, but it felt like my wheels were already hydroplaning on the wet pavement. The mysterious bikers surrounded my car, their rain-ragged shadows drawing closer and closer on each side. Their bodies, or long white bones, were hidden by black leather, and behind their scarred helmets their faces, with the skin all gone, were completely anonymous. I couldn't maneuver without their permission, and they knew it. It was getting harder and harder to see. The rain was a gray sheet that covered even the dead branches of the roadside trees. As the road curved, I noticed the cyclists around me were pushing me, forcing me to make sharper and sharper turns to avoid hitting them. I would even have risked it, if I wasn't sure that hitting one of them would make me have an accident myself. I don't know how long they kept it up. The cheesy 50s music, the deafening engines, the knuckle-whiting head games. It was meant to break me for what came next. The Ghosts of John began to slow down. They wanted to force me to stop. To make me face the 6 of them, alone, on a storm-washed country road. My heart pounding, I skidded to a stop with them in a gravel pull-off. They shut off their engines. Without that roaring, the only sound was the wind-lashed rain. In unison, the dark figures dismounted. Slowly, one turned toward me, reaching for his helmet, about to reveal what lay beneath. I stomped on the accelerator. The riders had left a gap in their wall when they dismounted their antique cycles, and I took it. Although whether I passed through their line because I got lucky or because the bikers were something otherworldly, I couldn't say. I swerved madly on the slick, windy roads. I nearly crashed through the guardrail of a bridge and into the roaring waters below. Maybe that, I realized, was the point. I drove home as fast as the wretched weather would allow. I'm not sure if it was the damp, the stress, or something else, but my experience with the dark riders put me into bed with chills and a fever. Sleeping and waking, dreams and hallucinations blended so easily that I was unable to tell the difference. Like the man who I saw and heard pacing through the house, lost in thought. He had the long bowl cut and beard of 70s style, and the suede jacket elbow patches of a college professor. When my eyes would flicker open, I'd sometimes spot him at my desk, scrutinizing yellowed manuscripts. The phantasmal professor's presence was almost comforting, at first. As time passed, his behavior became more and more erratic, swinging from ecstasy to plate-smashing rage. I'm sure I imagined the next part, because no human could have survived it. I woke in the depths of fever sometime in the lost hours of the night, and dragged myself to the kitchen to make a cup of tea. When I returned, I saw the professor, plain as day, backlit by the lamplight. He was surrounded by dangling, skeletal figures, like puppets. They hung from every available surface. In front of him was an antique wooden trunk. He held a Bowie knife in his hand, and he was laughing. Of course, I thought I heard him giggle. So simple, why didn't I see it before? Cheerfully humming the song, the professor peeled away thick, juicy cuts of his own flesh. He kept going, in fact, until there was nothing left. When he'd finished, he put the skin suit in the chest, sealed it, and carried it off, still chuckling to himself. I blinked. The hideous vision disappeared. I slipped back beneath the sheets and sipped my tea, wondering what my feverish brain would kick up next. By Monday I felt better. The hallucinations and bizarre dreams had stopped, but I was still left with more questions than answers. I decided to visit Sarah again at the library. The moment Sarah saw me walk through the door, however, she scurried off. I finally caught up to her in the stacks, trying to look busy. "You're avoiding me," I accused her. "Oh, I have no idea what you're I did the research you suggested. I even played the song again." At this, Sarah stopped speaking and went pale. She looked to both ends of the narrow shelves, as though she expected monsters to come and carve us up. "You shouldn't have done that," the librarian muttered to herself. "The more you play it, the more you talk about it, the more you think about it, the worse it gets." Her eyes darted from side to side again. "It's too dim back here. We're alone. We shouldn't even be discussing this." But how did it start? I wondered aloud. I mean, if it's even real, then surely there must be a way to stop it. "If it's even real," Sarah hissed, "I can see in your face that it has started happening to you, too, and you dare doubt it. If you've let the song into your life this far and you're still alive, I don't know what to tell you. Get away from here and forget about it, if it isn't already too late. I am not talking about this." I told her about the bikers. She looked miserable the whole time, half wanting to cover her ears, half dying to know more. "Leaving town is out then," she murmured to herself. "It'll get you on the roads." I told her about the professor. "It's in your house already then," Sarah frowned. "It is too late." She gave my shoulder a little squeeze. "I'm sorry." Hurrying off, she turned one last time, and we did not have this conversation. I was expected at school the next day. Back among my piles of sheet music and childish instruments, I barely remembered where I'd left off. But it didn't take me long to find out. It warmed my heart how the students welcomed me back and even helped me find my place in their lessons. To them, of course, I'd only been out sick. They had no idea of the nightmare I'd been living since I'd played the song. The older ones waved to me with toothy grins, and the younger ones gave me those headbutting hugs that small children seem to specialize in. I just needed to distract myself, I thought, so I did something I'd sworn I'd never do. I played Christmas music in October. The kids were a little shocked, but the change of season did me good. In the classroom, singing Jingle Bells and learning the history of Saint Nick, it was easy to pretend that I'd never heard of ghosts, hauntings, or Halloween. Outside the school building, however, the late autumn air seemed eager to remind me. Instead of crisp white snowdrifts, dead brown leaves swirled beneath the bare skeletons of the trees. Instead of colorful lights and holly, houses were decorated with fake cobwebs, wooden tombstones, and other reminders of the long hand of death. Instead of ice skaters and carolers, the streets abounded with children in costumes that, for the first time, struck me as grotesque, twisted, and wrong. When trick-or-treaters jumped out from behind hay bales or pumpkin piles, their masked faces frightened me far more than their intended targets, who ran away shrieking gleefully. What was fun for them had become, for me, deadly serious. I realized how much I'd been affected when I looked out the kitchen window a few nights before Halloween. I screamed silently when I saw the long white bones of a skeleton beneath the twisted apple tree in front of the house. It was watching me. I don't know how long I stood staring into the black pits of its eyes, at its hideous bony grin, its dead intensity. But finally I realized that it wasn't moving. With a kitchen knife in my trembling fist, I crept outside to face it. I saw the string. I gave the skeleton a shove. Plastic. I was still laughing at my own pathetic fate when I felt a tug on my elbow made me turn. A child was there. Was it one of my students? "Excuse me, miss," the child rasped, "can I have some of your skin?" What? I was sure I'd misunderstood. "Can I have your skin, miss? It sure is chilly with no skin on." That was when I realized that the child wasn't wearing a costume. The thing before me was draped in a simple blanket, like a mortuary sheet, that was stained red. It was the kind of stain that might come from a small body with all of its flesh flayed off, I thought. There were no eye or mouth holes for a child to breathe through the blood-soaked fabric, and it held only a single tallow candle for light. I backed away slowly. I didn't start running until 4 other identical shapes drifted out of the gloom, candles flickering on their faceless wrappings. Despite their small size and inability to see, they pursued me quickly through the cracked bracken, mud, and heaps of leaves. They'd come between me and my rented house, and like a panicked animal I bolted dead ahead. And straight into the woods behind my house. Soon the only light came from the candles held by the 5 child-sized figures that pursued me through the damp and foggy darkness. Tripping and slipping over gnarled roots and rotten logs, I understood with horror that I was being herded. The destination was clear, a silvery clearing dominated by a single dead tree. Now that I've stood in that clearing, I say that I have, indeed, seen the ghost of John. Oh yes, we all have. The 5 student singers, Professor Hatterwood, the town's first motorcycle gang, other figures too old to name, and still others who walked in those woods before names even existed. We have all seen those long white bones. I don't know why I was allowed to leave the clearing. Perhaps the ghost wants its song and story spread, or perhaps it knows that I'll be back before All Hallows Eve. You see, where that haunted child touched my elbow, a gray spot began to grow. Little by little, the flesh around it grew pale and crumbled away like dust. Most of my left arm is bone now, and the change seems to be growing faster. It sure is going to be chilly with no skin on.